So, my background's actually in physics initially, but then I shifted over into cognitive psychology, and most of my work, undergraduate work, was in cognitive psychology, and then I did some psycholinguistics, and I ended up with a PhD in intercultural communication, which it wasn't at the time an odd thing, you know, but it turns out to have been something that was becoming more and more important, you know, this idea that somehow people of different cultures, and we define culture in a very broad way, you know, so different groups that were sort of had different worldviews, and we didn't think it was particularly national cultures or ethnic cultures or what we would now think of as race-based cultures or gender. I mean, those were all possible permutations of culture from the very beginning of intercultural communication. But then as that field developed, it became more sort of internationally oriented rather than so domestically oriented.
Yeah.
So now there's a bit of a split. But the particular work that you're referring to is called the Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity. And sensitivity doesn't refer to kind of touchy-feely sensitivity. It means perceptual sensitivity. You know, as in being sensitive to wine, for instance, or sensitive to color. You know, having an eye for something, an eye for color.
Mm-hmm.
You know, meaning that you're able to be sensitive to perceptual nuances.
Yes.
And so I've taken this idea of perception based on Piaget, basically. You know, and most people are familiar with Piaget's work.
Especially in my community of
Yes,
psychologists.
yeah, exactly, right. You know, so children are developing their perception of the world by incorporating differentiations that they make into category systems, and then making that more complex and more complex and more complex. Okay. So I took that idea and said we can apply that to the way that people respond to culture.
Mm-hmm.
That, again, culture in the general
Yes.
sense. And I divided that continuum then up into two major parts: ethnocentrism and ethno-relativism, where the centrism was kind of seeing your own culture as being the model for everything in the world.
Yeah.
And ethno-relativism is seeing your culture as kind of one way of being in the world.
Yeah.
So that's the relativism idea. And then the stages, these kind of positions along the continuum.
Yeah, that's
or
why
the-
I was wondering
yeah,
which
yeah,
word should I
yeah.
use, because
Well,
it did look like something progressive.
Well, it is progressive, you know, in the same sense that Piaget is progressive, in
Yeah.
the same sense that learning calculus is progressive.
Yes.
I mean, you can't just like go out and expose yourself to formulae and say, now I know calculus.
Exactly.
I mean, you have to learn arithmetic and
Yes.
geometry and, you know, and so forth. You want to be a wine connoisseur, you can't just start drinking wine and say, oh, you know, you have
I know all
to
of it.
learn about all the differentiations.
Yeah.
You know, so similarly, we're using that same idea to say it's a developmental process of getting better at doing this, which in this case is the perception of cultural difference, or another way of saying it is the perception of how we distinguish us and them, how we distinguish otherness, basically. You know.
That was a title
Yeah.
that really attracted my
Yeah.
attention.
And it's important for us to
Yes.
realize that we're constructing that. You know, this
Exactly.
is not something that's out in the world waiting for us to see it.
Yeah.
You know, this is a construction, a collective construction of us and them. And,
Yeah.
you know, this is who we are, and
This is what
those
they are.
Those are they are. Okay. At the initial stage of this, I call it denial. And in the psychological sense of denial, the inability to perceive yourself doing something, that people are not able to see themselves involved in this perception of otherness, you know, even though they may be doing it at some rudimentary level.
Yeah.
And as a result, they don't see themselves in cultural terms either. So they don't see others in cultural terms, and because of that, they can't see themselves in cultural terms. So when you try to talk to somebody at this stage, this initial stage, they have no idea what you're talking about, because there are no relevant categories. And these may be very sophisticated people otherwise.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're the presidents of the country. And so they could be sophisticated in their own context, but they are really like dead simple relative to otherness.
Exactly.
Yeah, and of course that's a dangerous combination. If
That
one
we
of-
know the result of.
If one of their jobs is to deal with otherness.
Exactly.
Yeah. Then the next stage I call defense, which is where you have a kind of rudimentary distinction of us and them, but it's so simple that you see others in these kind of stereotypical and frequently threatening terms,
Exactly.
because the self that's been created is quite a nascent, quite a vulnerable self in a cultural self now.
Yeah.
And the cultural self is easily overwhelmed by your idea of the other. And so you become all defensive and trying to defend yourself and being negatively stereotyping of the other, all as a kind of existential issue
Exactly.
of maintaining
It's
this,
based of
Yeah,
just this survival
exactly,
attitude.
this nascent self.
Yes.
And an interesting aspect of that stage, or that position on the continuum, is sometimes we switch sides. And so rather than protecting us against them, we take the side of them and protect them against us. And this happens from going native, for instance, in what's called going native and internationally, or sometimes it's the false ally position domestically, where people take on the cause of oppressed people, and these are from dominant culture folks who take on the cause of oppressed people, but they do so in this kind of simplistic and romanticized way.
Yeah.
And typically it's not very appreciated by the people that they're trying to help.
help. Yeah.
So then it moves to the minimization. And minimization is that discovery that we're all basically human, 2 arms, 2 legs,
Yeah.
and it's kind of the small world after all,
Yeah.
kumbaya. Perceptually, the way that works is that we see ourselves as being the model for otherness. And so we see others as being sort of slight variations of ourselves. So they have different customs, they eat different food, they might wear some different clothes,
Yeah.
but basically they're like us.
Yeah.
And so the things that go along with that are things like tolerance. We'll tolerate the fact that you eat different food that doesn't smell very good, because basically
We're the same.
we're all just human. And
Yeah.
that's where this kind of people tend to be interested in equality. And they say, well, you should treat everybody the same, which of course raises the question of why would people want to be treated the same?
Exactly.
And the answer always is, well, because basically we're the same. If I treat you the way I want to be treated, well, that's good enough. And you can see that's the golden rule, of course.
Yeah.
And you can see that it works in your own group, because people in your own group actually are kind of like you.
They have more similarities. They have more aspects in common.
So I can treat, insofar as we're similar, I can treat you the way I'd like to be treated, and that's better than other things I could be doing.
And
right?
it's working with others, so
Yes, it
why
is.
shouldn't it work with you?
Exactly. However, the more that we're dealing with actual otherness, meaning people that are not simply slight variations of ourselves, which are mostly people in our own culture then that fall into that category, but people who in fact live in different cultural groups, doesn't work. No, people don't want to be treated the way that you want to be treated. So how do you do it? Well, then we need to accept, and the next stage is called acceptance, where we shift into the idea that other people indeed are human like us, but we are differently complex. I'm a complex person, and you're a person, and also complex, but not complex in the same way that I am.
Exactly, my own way.
Right. So that then shifts, so we maintain the idea of common humanity, but add the dimension of complex differences. And that's, I call acceptance, not agreement, but we just accept the existence of that.
And you're not talking about individual complexity necessarily.
No, this is all at the worldview level,
Exactly.
sort of a collective,
Exactly.
where individuals, of course, are
Yeah.
not representative of the group, but the group, in a particular group, you're likely to see the probability of seeing certain behavior is higher.
Mm-hmm.
So groups of people that, for instance, stress how they're individually different from one another, which we call individuality. Western cultures relative to Asian cultures, for
For
instance,
instance,
who are more collectivist.
collectivists.
Now, mind you, the cultures themselves are not individualist and collectivist. This is us making the observation,
Of
making the
that
contrast.
being that way.
Yeah, it's like wine. It doesn't have bouquet. It's us bringing that perception to it, right? So this is the same thing. But when we do that, we can say, it's not that every Chinese person is collectivist and every U.S. American is individualistic. There are a lot of collectivist individual Americans
In this
and a
society,
lot of
exactly.
individualistic Chinese, and that they themselves may not think of themselves in those terms. But we can observe, with that observational framework, the probability of seeing collectivist behavior is higher in that Asian group than it is in that North American group.
Yeah.
That's the kind of contrast that we're able to start using when we're at that acceptance stage.
Yeah.
Then, okay, enough on that.
Yeah. But I think the acceptance, because when you explain the model, you were saying, well, if we can bring it to the end, and people, the end is the answer, at least try to bring them to acceptance. So I really wanted to make a point that
It's
this
important.
is what it is.
Yeah, it's getting us out of that idea that
Exactly.
other people are variations on us.
Exactly.
Yeah. But the next stage then is adaptation, where we're able to use that idea of different complexity to sort of overcome, the fundamental attribution error. Where we think we're complex and they're simple.
Exactly.
We sort of
Yeah.
overcome that, and in overcoming it allows us to empathize, and I think for the first time allows us to empathize.
I like that.
I really don't think that we can empathize
Before.
cross-culturally, however we define culture, until we have gone through that acceptance of the equal complexity of the other. Otherwise, we're empathizing with more simplistic stereotypes. We're making fundamental attribution error by thinking that we're complex and they're simple,
Yeah.
and we can understand them in simple terms, but they can't understand us
Yeah.
in those same
Yeah.
simple terms.
Yeah.
So we get by that. That sets up the conditions for mutual adaptation. Where I'm adapting to you, you're adapting to me.
Exactly.
And rather than ships be passing in the night, we generate this third culture space.
I like
The place where I'm a little different than I would be otherwise with somebody else. You're a little different than you would
Because
be
we
with
are
somebody
both
else.
co-creating.
Yeah, so
that
we're in
space.
this third culture space, right? And organizations, companies, or societies that support the existence of those spaces are typically more successful. We know that companies are more successful when they do that, and by extension, we think societies are more successful.
And this is exactly what brought to my understanding that the way I work with cross-cultural couples goes precisely to that co-created, what I call life project. I like that you use the third culture, because what I try to explain to the couples that move globally is that they don't need to neither deny the culture they're going to land in or deny the culture that they're bringing in, that somehow they have to learn how to create this third culture,
Precisely.
that space that they're going to hold as partners, and that's what they're going to bring to their children, and this is how they're going to be successful as an organization, because families are organization in the essential. But before that, before I can get my patients to actually co-create that third culture, they need to go through all the stages.
Right.
They
Yeah.
can't make it
You
otherwise.
can't just talk to somebody who's in one of those ethnocentric positions and say, "Oh, you need to do this." They have no
Exactly.
idea. They have no idea what you're talking about.
Exactly.
They can't.
Exactly.
And the last stage I call integration, which is basically you start defining your identity in this way. I call it, seeing yourself living in the liminal space, which is the in-between space. And you can move in and out of cultures. You can move in and out of these third culture spaces, but you yourself see your identity as being a kind of an in-between identity. And the good part of that is you're able to move around
You're
easily.
much more flexible.
Yeah, the bad part of it is you don't really belong anywhere.
Yeah.
you
Well,
know. And most expats, most people
or
who,
third culture
who
kids
operate in this,
nowadays.
when it comes down to it, they know that they're a little bit different
Yeah.
than the people in any of those groups.
Yeah.
And that's just something that you live with.
Exactly. But the moment that you understand that there is no such thing, as you were saying, like a proper reality you all need to see, it becomes much more, I would say, lighter to accept all these nuances and differences around us. So
Yeah, you referred to the, I know.
You-
Let me just
yes,
underline
please
that
do.
to the epistemological dimension of this, which is actually the underlying set of assumptions about the nature of reality
Yes.
is changing from the ethnocentric thinking there is an identifiable reality to the acceptance of sort of cultural relativity and it's
and
your-
co-creation of that reality.
Your perception is different than mine, to the co-creation of that reality, which is the more constructivist epistemology at the end.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Milton. I think this is very useful and helpful. Also, hopefully, for companies to understand that when it comes to international mobility, the people that are actually being expatriated and confronted to all these situations are going through that, both in the company and the country where they are destinated, but also at home. So there is all this complexity happening for that.
So there's a
same
lot
feeling.
written about this, and I encourage you and your readers to take a look at
So there is
some
a
of the
lot,
follow-up.
written about this, and how and where do we get that?
The easiest place is www.idrinstitute.org, which is the website. There's a lot of downloadable material, including quite a bit on this thing called the DMIS, Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.